Good morning, everyone. I'm Erin Kelly from Tufts University. I'd like to welcome you to this panel on morality, reciprocity, and political justice. We have three very distinguished speakers. It's exciting to have them here speaking on this panel. And rather than read their bios, because I think that most of you will know of these speakers already, I'll just introduce them by their university affiliations, and we'll get started with the panel. Each speaker will speak for 25 minutes, and then we'll have conversation. So our first speaker will be Stephen Darwall from Yale University. Our second speaker will be Samuel Schefller from NYU. They're both professors of philosophy. Danielle Allen, James Bryant Conant, university professor at Harvard, and also director of the Schefller Center. So thank you all very much for being here. We're going to get started right away. So, Professor Darwall, thank you.
Can you hear me? Okay? Yeah, good, great. So it's a great honor to be here. Thanks so much to Michael, to Ludek, for his support of the conference, everybody who's been involved in organizing it. I just want to start with a couple of remarks about my personal sense of indebtedness and gratitude to John Rawls, both his ideas, of course, and to him, the person. I was finishing graduate school in 1971 at the University of Pittsburgh when A Theory of Justice came out, and like so many of us who were alive and reading philosophy at that point, I just became completely absorbed in it. And I went, luckily for me, to the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill in 1972 as a young assistant professor. And I found there Arthur Kuflick, who had come the year before from Princeton and who had studied with Jack as an undergraduate and who was just utterly immersed in Jack's ideas. And those of you who know Arthur know he's quite voluble and likes to talk philosophy. So we had a 24/7 seminar, it seemed, on Rawls and Kant as well. And then also at Chapel Hill was David Falk, W.D. Falk. Those of you who don't know him, marvelous philosopher, invented the terms internalism, externalism, really got that whole debate started. And he was also a Kant maven. And anyway, so Jack came to the Chapel Hill Colloquium in 1972 and was in a session that Tim actually chaired. And that was the first time I met Rawls, and he insisted on me calling him Jack, and he was just incredibly generous. And then in the first years of my career, would write to me asking to see stuff I was writing, and then he'd say nice things about it, and it just meant a lot. And my ideas were very much influenced by Rawls, certainly in that period, and in some way always. I think also it's important to emphasize Jack's role in re-energizing the history of ethics, especially the philosophically engaged study of Kant's moral philosophy. Rawls's own philosophizing was always conducted in conversation with historical figures, and as his lectures on the history of moral philosophy attest, he also had a serious interest in the history of ethics for its own sake. Of special importance, of course, was his interest in Kant and his reinvigorating of philosophical scholarship on Kant and the development and elaboration of Kantian ideas in contemporary moral and political philosophy. From the Kantian interpretation of A Theory of Justice to Kantian constructivism of the Dewey Lectures and political liberalism. Rawls's influence on Kant scholarship has been massive. All of the following Kant scholars wrote their dissertations with Rawls at Harvard: Christine Korsgaard, Barbara Herman, Honora O'Neill, Adrian Piper, Hannah Ginsburg, Tom Hill, Andrews Reith, Thomas Pogge, Susan Nyman, and Daniel Warren, and there may be others that I'm leaving out. So just a complete sea change in both interest in the history of ethics and in Kant in particular. It's a mark of Rawls's fertility and influence as a thinker that philosophers can follow his lead in different directions. For example, both of the major contending camps on egalitarian political justice derive from Rawls. both so-called luck egalitarians on the one hand and relational or democratic egalitarians on the other, as Elizabeth Anderson calls them, find fundamental inspiration in Rawls. Rawls's famous remarks in Theory of Justice that justice cannot, quote, weight men's shares in the benefits and burdens of social cooperation according to their social fortune. By the way, it just occurred to me to ask, do you folks have a handout? Oh. Sorry. Let's see.
They're right here.
They're right here. Oh,
Yeah.
of course. They're safekeeping. Yeah, right. They're very safe. Nobody's taken a single one. Thank you very much. Actually, I'll take one too, actually. Right. Yeah, that's, the reason it came up in my mind was that's the first quote that's on the handout, so you haven't missed a thing. Okay. So the first quote is justice, cannot weight men's shares in the benefits and burdens of social cooperation according to their social fortune or luck in the natural lottery. So in saying that, he seems to have just stated the fundamental luck egalitarian idea. As Larry Temkin puts it, it's bad, unjust, and unfair for some to be worse off than others through no fault or choice of their own. Rawls makes these remarks in the course of an informal argument for the difference principle. Beginning with a general formulation of the second principle of justice, and here we're actually in the train of Tim's talk yesterday, social and economic inequalities are to be arranged so that they are, A, reasonably expected to be to everyone's advantage, that's the general formulation, and B, attached to positions and offices open to all. Rawls considers two more specific interpretations of both of those clauses. Positions can be considered equally open, either because they're open to talents, careers open to talents idea, or because they meet a more demanding conditions of equality of fair opportunity. And they can be understood to be to everyone's advantage either because they satisfy a principle of efficiency or Pareto optimality, or because they satisfy the difference principle, that is, work to the greatest advantage of the least advantaged group. Rawls thus appears to make use of the basic luck egalitarian idea in the course of arguing for the difference principle, at least as against a principle of efficiency as an interpretation of the most general formulation of his second principle of justice. Of course, as luck egalitarians sometimes argue, the difference principle may permit outcomes that the fundamental luck egalitarian idea would rule out. Fair equality of opportunity apparently excludes social and economic inequalities being subject to social fortune, but if it rules out their being subject to the natural lottery for talent, then that would seem to prohibit a society's taking advantage of talent through incentives to increase the overall stock of goods in ways that might maximally advantage the least advantaged. So even if the luck egalitarian idea gives Rawls an intuitive argument for the difference principle in comparison with the principle of efficiency, it may push farther than Rawls himself wanted to go. In any case, Rawls stresses, as Elizabeth Anderson points out, that, quote, none of the precedents from Theory of Justice, none of the preceding remarks about the moral arbitrariness of social contingencies and natural chance are an argument, either for fair equality of opportunity or for the difference principle, since, he says, in a contract theory, all arguments, strictly speaking, are to be made in terms of what it would be rational to choose in the original position. Anderson argues that relational egalitarianism is truer to the main lines of Rawls's thought than luck egalitarianism is. In What is the Point of Equality, she is content to argue that luck egalitarianism is mistakenly attributed to Rawls, but in a later paper, The Fundamental Disagreement Between Luck Egalitarians and Relational Egalitarians, she cites Rawls as a relational egalitarian, along with Sam Schefler and Josh Cohen. Her main reason for doing so, as I read her, is Rawls's idea expressed clearly for the first time in the Dewey lectures that to be a person is to be a self-originating source of valid claims. So that's the idea that I really want to look at now. As Anderson analyzes the debate, luck egalitarians take justice to be primarily a function of relative outcomes. how we fare compared with one another, and whether or not relative disadvantages result from things outside our control. Natural lotteries of talent, for example, and social lottery. Relative bad fortune is itself an injustice for which justice requires compensation. As Arneson puts it, the concern of distributive justice is to compensate individuals for misfortune. If, however, injustices are suffered by persons, and if persons are, in their nature, self-originating sources of valid claims, then injustice must consist in disrespect for such claims, and therefore disrespect for the persons themselves as sources of the claim's validity. This makes justice a matter of treatment, of how we are related to by individuals and institutions, and never of outcomes pure and simple. Equal justice consists in being treated, that is, respected and related to, as an equal. So understood, egalitarian justice is realized in relations of mutual respect of one another as equals, as having the same underlying authority as sources of valid claims that all have. On such a conception, respect is not, or at least not just, a good, with equal respect consisting in people having equal amounts of that good. Respect of the relevant kind, what I'd call moral recognition respect, is rather for someone as an equal, that is, as a person who, as a self-originating source of valid claims, has the same basic authority to make claims and demands of others that anyone else does. This is a distinctive kind of value that is irreducible to any kind of good that might be the object of justified desire or esteem. It's a kind of value to which the appropriate response is recognition, respect, for a fundamental claim originating authority. Anderson connects this Rawlsian idea, which grounds her relational egalitarianism, to what I call basic second personal authority, that is shared by all persons. The crucial point is that claims must be addressed to those on whom they're made and bid for their addressee's recognition. They necessarily aim to realize, therefore, a second personal relation of reciprocal recognition. They bid for an addressee's recognition of the validity of the claim, and hence for the claimant's authority to make it. And they implicitly recognize the other's authority to recognize both the validity of the claim and the authority of the claimant. Any putatively legitimate claim or demand, I argue, is committed to a shared second personal authority of the claimant and addressee alike to make claims and demands of each other and hold one another accountable. Obviously, that requires a good bit of argument. As I see it, therefore, the Rawlsian idea that persons are self-originating sources of valid claims necessarily fits with the conception of morality as equal or mutual accountability, for which I've argued in the second person standpoint in a number of essays since. Though I call this morality as equal accountability, we could as well call it morality as reciprocity. But morality is not reciprocity conceived of as tit for tat, or as in the contractarian views of Hobbes and Gautier, self-restraint for mutual advantage. It's rather a form of reciprocity that consists in instantiating reciprocal recognition for persons in their shared second personal authority. This is, I believe, how Rawls understands the idea when he says in Political Liberalism, quote, that the idea of reciprocity lies between the idea of impartiality as being moved by the general good and the idea of mutual advantage understood as everyone's being advantaged with respect to each person's present or expected future situation as things are. Reciprocal recognition of one another as equals is a fundamentally moral relation. Arguably, it's the fundamental relation of morality. Now, Rawls first introduces the idea that persons are self-originating sources of valid claims in the Dewey Lectures as a central element of what he there calls Kantian constructivism. The Dewey Lectures occupy a distinctive position in Rawls's philosophical trajectory. Delivered 9 years after A Theory of Justice, or at least published then, they constitute Rawls's last publication before his political turn, first in Justice as Fairness, Political, Not Metaphysical, and then, of course, in Political Liberalism. Quite differently from political liberalism, Rawls's project in the Dewey Lectures would appear to be meta-ethical. Kantian constructivism provides, he says, a theory of moral objectivity, holding that it can be, quote, understood in terms of a suitably constructed social point of view that all can accept. Rawls there contrasts constructivism with rational intuitionism, which holds that there is a self-evident moral order that is prior, these are quotes, I think on your sheet, that is prior to and independent of our conception of the person or any suitably constructed social point of view that employs it. The Dewey Lectures aim to show how the argument from the original position, understood in terms of a model conception of the person as a self-originating source of claims, can be seen to provide a meta-ethical framework for the normative theory of justice as fairness and also for what he calls rightness as fairness in TJ, set out in Theory of Justice. Constructivism plays an important role in political liberalism, of course, also, but there it's what he calls political constructivism, which he explicitly distinguishes from Kantian moral constructivism, which in political liberalism's terms is a comprehensive view. By contrast, we might almost title the Dewey Lectures Kantian constructivism, metaphysical, not political. In the time remaining, I want to consider how Kantian constructivism and its claim that persons are self-originating sources of valid claims contrasts with the Kantian interpretation in A Theory of Justice. And to consider the philosophical implications of this development. Both the Kantian interpretation and Kantian constructivism share the Kantian view that, as Rawls put it in A Theory of Justice, moral legislation is to be agreed to under conditions that characterize men as free and equal rational beings. It's common to both works that the parties to the original position are conceived of as representatives of free and equal moral persons, and therefore that principles of justice, or perhaps morality more generally, must be choice-worthy from that point of view. But the two works differ in what they take freedom in free and equal to consist in. In A Theory of Justice, Rawls understands it as the Kantian idea that freedom consists in, quote, independence from the contingencies of nature and society. Moral agents can choose their own ends. They're not simply subject to forms of motivation given by nature or society. Free persons conceive of themselves as beings who can revise and alter their final ends, Rawls says. This gets carried forward in the Dewey Lectures' claim that persons have a moral power consisting in, quote, the capacity to form, to revise, and rationally to pursue a conception of the good. To make it more evident that parties in the original position represent free moral persons, the Dewey Lectures gives the parties a highest order interest to realize and exercise this moral power. In the Dewey Lectures, however, this power, which Rawls calls independence, is only one aspect of what he there calls freedom. To independence, he adds a second aspect of freedom, namely that persons are self-originating sources of valid claims. He cites slavery as an illustration that this is indeed an aspect of freedom. Slaves are human beings who are not counted as self-originating sources of claims at all, he says. This, he says, makes clear why counting moral personality itself as a source of claims is an aspect of freedom. In the Dewey Lectures, then, Rawls brings in the idea that persons have a fundamentally equal authority in that each is a self-originating source of claims as a further essential feature of Kantian constructivism. This played no role in A Theory of Justice, even, we might note, in the 1999 revised edition. But what difference does this edition really make? It's revealing here to consider points Rawls makes in the section on the Kantian interpretation in Theory of Justice in responding to a criticism he attributes to Sidgwick. Rawls develops here the idea that principles of justice chosen in the original position can be linked to the Kantian idea of autonomy. Kant held, he writes, that a person is acting autonomously when the principles of his action are chosen by him as the most adequate possible expression of his nature as a free and equal rational being. Rawls then cites Sidgwick as remarking that, quote, nothing in Kant's ethics is more striking than the idea that a man realizes his true self when he acts from the moral law, whereas if he permits his actions to be determined by sensuous desires or contingent aims, he becomes subject to the law of nature. But Sedgwick objects, Rawls continues, that, quote, on Kant's view, the lives of the saint and the scoundrel are equally the outcome of a free choice on the part of the noumenal self and equally the subject of causal laws as a phenomenal self. Rawls says, Sedgwick's objection is decisive so long as one takes a noumenal choice of principles to be unconstrained by anything but consistency. A scoundrel could guide themselves unfailingly on consistent self-given principles and indeed take such principles to override strong motivations to the contrary. But Rawls says that would still fall short of what Kant's idea involves. The missing part of the argument, Rawls says, concerns the concept of expression. We can realize our true rational selves only by, he says, expressing it in our actions. Kant did not show, he writes, that acting from the moral law expresses our nature in identifiable ways that acting from contrary principles doesn't. The concept of the original position makes good this defect. If we think of the original position as the point of view from which noumenal selves see the world, and think of the parties as having a desire to express their nature as free and equal members of the intelligible realm, then Rawls thinks the defect to which Sedgwick objected can be eliminated. Now, there are certainly questions that could be raised about Rawls's reply to Sedgwick. If we take for granted the aim of justifying principles of justice, then the fundamental Rawlsian idea that such principles must be able to be justified from an original position by a choice of free and rational persons is very attractive. But how are we supposed to get from that to the further Kantian claim that action on such principles best expresses our free and rational nature? For that, we'd need the further claim that complying with principles of justice or morality expresses our free and rational nature, which nothing in the original position as a device for justifying principles of justice could possibly support. The point is similar, I think, to one that Kant makes at the end of the second section of the groundwork, when he says that all of the concepts and claims he's made in the first two sections, including autonomy, are simply analytic of what he calls the generally received idea of morality. That autonomy and morality are indeed aspects of pure practical reason, however, are synthetic a priori propositions, which he says can only be established by a critique of practical reason. Kant attempts famously to do this in section 3 of the groundwork, but in the critique of practical reason, he holds that no such argument can work, and in the fact of reason passage says that we can gain knowledge of autonomy only through our recognition of the moral law. That seems right to me. There seems no way to get either the idea of morality or autonomy as Kant understands it from the materials of rational choice alone. Consider also what Rawls goes on to say regarding the claim that acting on principles we can affirm in the original position expresses our nature as free and rational. It's for this reason, I believe, this is Rawls, that Kant speaks of the failure to act on the moral law as giving rise to shame and not feelings of guilt. And this is appropriate, since for him acting unjustly is acting in a manner that fails to express our nature as free and rational beings. In other words, in failing to live up to our independence, in the Dewey Lectures sense, we've acted beneath ourselves and naturally feel shame, the feeling that one is aptly looked down on or is unpresentable in some way. By contrast, the other aspect of the freedom of persons, that persons have a fundamental authority as a source of valid claims, is a potential source of guilt rather than shame. Failing to respond adequately to others' legitimate claims grounded in their equal authority as a person to make them just is failing to respect them as moral equals, and the feeling that one has done so is guilt. Guilt has a conceptual connection to accountability that shame lacks. It's the feeling through which we hold ourselves accountable for doing something we're aptly held accountable for. It's this connection to accountability that puts us into the space of deontic concepts of obligation, right, rights, and justice. It's a conceptual truth, I claim, that actions are obligatory or wrong not to do if and only if omitting them would be blameworthy, lacking excuse, where blame is a Strawsonian reactive attitude through which we hold people, ourselves and others, accountable, and bid for their recognition of our authority to do so. Guilt is self-blame. This is why Rawls's idea that persons are self-originating sources of valid claims does real conceptual work. Without that idea, we can't say that persons can be treated unjustly and wronged. And with it, we can say that the dignity of persons includes a shared authority that makes us accountable to one another. In my view, this is the aspect of our moral freedom that most deeply underlies the idea of justice, and indeed deontic morality more generally. Thank you.
Hey, like all of the other speakers, I'm indebted to Michael and to Ludek and all of the other organizers for arranging this conference and inviting me to participate. And like everyone else who works in these areas, I'm indebted in very many ways to the work of John Rawls, and had the good fortune to interact with him in many ways over a long period of time. I'm going to resist the temptation today to discuss those interactions. I hope to do some of that in a talk that I hope, present at a conference Paul Weichmann's organizing in Notre Dame in a couple of years. But for today, my topic will be completely different. The topic is John Rawls on Donald Trump. These are difficult times for liberal theorists. Fewer than 30 years after the end of the Cold War ushered in a period of unprecedented liberal ascendancy, liberalism is in retreat, or at least on the defensive, in many parts of the world. A new generation of authoritarian strongmen have come to power in a number of countries, riding waves of populist, nationalist, and anti-globalist sentiment, and other countries may well be headed in the same direction. It's tempting to interpret these developments as revealing a deep flaw of some kind in liberalism. As one political scientist told the New York Times, what we've been seeing is a kind of backlash to liberal democracy, adding that masses of people feel they've not been properly represented in liberal democracy. Some critics have suggested that the recent developments represent a reaction against liberalism's excessive individualism, or against its failure to recognize the importance of national identity or patriotic sentiment, or against its marginalization of religion, or against its devaluation of the nation state, or its general tendency to privilege the global and universal over the local and particular. Others have suggested that the fault lies with contemporary liberalism's insufficient individualism, with its creation of huge state bureaucracies exercising control over virtually every area of human life, or with its endorsement of unsustainable social welfare programs, or with its policies of rights inflation. Although self-criticism and self-reflection are rarely out of place, we should be cautious about drawing drastic theoretical conclusions from recent political developments. There are at least 3 reasons for caution. First, liberalism is a broad church, and although recent political developments may reveal flaws in some versions of liberalism, they may teach us little about the flaws in other versions. For example, they may point to deficiencies in the so-called neoliberalism that has become prominent in recent decades, but they may reveal little about the deficiencies of other liberal theories. Second, the actual political societies and institutions that think of themselves as liberal and that are seen as such by others stand in a complex and uncertain relation to the familiar liberal theories debated by political philosophers and theorists. Bill Clinton and Barack Obama were not John Stuart Mill and Immanuel Kant. Still less were the 2 George Bushes. And the flaws and imperfections of actual liberal societies may or may not reflect any inadequacies in liberal theories. They may reveal only the extent to which actual societies have failed to conform to the requirements of liberal theory. Third, there's a danger here of blaming the victim. Liberal ideas and institutions have lately come under sustained assault by avowedly anti-liberal social and political forces, and it would be little short of tragic if the predominant liberal response was to engage in hand-wringing about the flaws of liberalism rather than to join the political and intellectual battle against the forces committed to subverting liberal democratic institutions. I agree with all of this. At the same time, we should acknowledge that there are also some points to be made on the other side. Whenever a political society that identifies itself with a particular political philosophy or ideology runs into serious trouble, it's common for defenders of that philosophy or ideology to argue that the society didn't subscribe to the right version of the view, or that the society's failures are due not to the deficiencies of the theory, but rather to the failure of the society to implement it fully or properly. Such claims are easy to make and difficult to falsify because it's almost always true that there were other versions of the theory and that the society did fail to implement its preferred version, or any version, fully or faithfully. This makes it all too easy for defenders of the theory to deny that the woes of the society count against the right version or the best version of the view. For example, Marxists could and did make such claims when and before the Soviet Union collapsed, and any liberals who were skeptical of those claims should be wary of relying too heavily on parallel claims when liberal societies run into trouble. And they should be wary not merely because of the easy availability and near unfalsifiability of such claims, but also because there's a real question how far the assessment of a political theory can remain unaffected by the fate of attempts to realize or implement the theory in practice. After all, one fact that any political theory must take into account is that such a theory must itself be implemented politically by flawed human beings, who will inevitably be subject to pressures of many different kinds, whose interests are likely to coincide only up to a point, and who, as my colleague Jeremy Waldron has long insisted, are bound to disagree about many things, including the very theory they're implementing. A theory would not be adequate as a theory if its appeal depended on a denial of these points. And so we should wonder, if sustained attempts to implement or realize a political theory run into serious difficulty, are we really so sure that this shows nothing at all about the merits of the theory? I concede these points, but in the remainder of this talk, I'll set them aside until the very end. I'll nevertheless try to take their general lesson to heart. My aim will not be merely to deploy the generic defensive strategy of denying that existing liberal societies have fully implemented the right version of liberalism. Instead, I'll argue that one version of liberal theory, the Rawlsian version, contains what is, in effect, a warning against the most egregious failure of liberal regimes in recent decades, at least in the United States, which is the failure to achieve, or even to strive seriously to achieve, an ideal of reciprocity. That warning provides the basis for a compelling diagnosis of the conditions that enabled Donald Trump to win the American presidency. We might call this the Rawlsian diagnosis of Trump's success. In providing this diagnosis, Rawls's theory shows that the rise of someone like Trump, in response to the failures of American political institutions, was entirely consistent with what the most influential contemporary version of liberal theory would lead one to expect. To that extent, Trump's success vindicates rather than undermines liberal theory. I hasten to add, though I assume it goes without saying, that the point of the Rawlsian diagnosis is not that Donald Trump is Rawlsian. It's rather that when liberal societies blatantly ignore the importance of reciprocity over a long period of time, it's not surprising that there should be a backlash, and that the form the backlash takes, although difficult to predict in advance, may be extremely dangerous. It's as likely to express itself in a repudiation of liberalism as in a renewed commitment to perfecting a liberal scheme. In Chapter 8 of A Theory of Justice, Rawls develops a moral psychology that's meant to underwrite his claims about the stability of his conception of justice. As usual, he takes utilitarianism as his foil, and his aim is to demonstrate that because utilitarianism requires a moral psychology of sympathy, it's less stable than his own theory, justice as fairness, which relies instead on a moral psychology of reciprocity. The thought, more fully spelled out, is that reciprocity is, in general, a more robust and secure feature of human psychology than is sympathy, that utilitarianism depends on a sympathy-based moral psychology, and that justice as fairness, by contrast, coheres smoothly with a reciprocity-based psychology. It's worth setting out the argument at somewhat greater length. Rawls argues that there's a deep human tendency to reciprocate the love of others and the concern they show for one's well-being. This tendency manifests itself in primitive form in young children, where it's implicated in the earliest stage of moral development, which Rawls calls the morality of authority. It then plays a crucial developmental role in the long process that leads, under favorable conditions, to the eventual emergence in adult human beings of mature moral motivation. The psychological and developmental role of reciprocity counts in favor of his principles, he says, because those principles are themselves reciprocity principles. They embody an idea of reciprocity in their very content. In a well-ordered society that conforms to his principles of justice, the good of all citizens is publicly affirmed, and that affirmation is manifested in the fundamental orientation of the society's basic institutional structure. In such a society, everyone's basic liberties are secured, all citizens enjoy fair equality of opportunity, and those who are better off forswear additional gains for themselves, except insofar as these would redound to the benefit of the worst off. In these concrete respects, a commitment to affirming the good of each citizen is inscribed into the basic charter and institutions of the society. This is the sense in which Rawls's principles are reciprocity principles. As such, he argues, they can generate their own support by drawing on sources of motivation that are especially powerful, because they're psychologically continuous with the developmentally most primitive forms of moral motivation. By contrast, utilitarianism is prepared to sacrifice the fundamental interests of some people in order to increase aggregate or average social welfare. If those who lose out in the utilitarian calculus are to accept their fate and to remain stably disposed to uphold utilitarian principles and institutions, as by definition would have to be the case in a stable, well-ordered utilitarian society, their sympathetic identification with their fellow citizens must be so great as to silence any unhappiness or resentment they might otherwise feel about the neglect of their interests. Although sympathy is an important feature of human psychology, Rawls believes it is not strong enough or securely enough situated within the human motivational repertoire to be a reliable source of support for utilitarian principles and institutions. What does this Rawlsian argument have to do with Donald Trump? On the one hand, Trump is neither a Rawlsian nor a utilitarian. Indeed, it's a stretch to attribute to him a coherent political philosophy of any kind. On the other hand, Rawls's principles of justice belong to his ideal theory, which assumes a well-ordered society in which there's strict compliance with the requirements of justice. This is in sharp contrast to the decidedly non-ideal circumstances of the world we actually inhabit. But although Rawls's ideal theory draws on his moral psychology, there's nothing idealized about that moral psychology itself or about the emphasis on reciprocity that's part of it. Rawls says that the parties in the original position, when selecting principles of justice to regulate a well-ordered society, know all there is to know about the laws of human psychology, as he calls them, and that from their perspective it is, quote, a consideration against a conception of justice that, in view of the laws of moral psychology, men would not acquire a desire to act upon it even when the institutions of their society satisfied it. Such a conception would not be able to generate its own support and so would have, quote, difficulty in securing the stability of social cooperation. He therefore insists that the parties in the original position, even when selecting principles of justice for the ideal case of a well-ordered society, must rely on a realistic moral psychology, and his claim that reciprocity is crucial to moral development should be seen in that light. If anything, it's utilitarianism, with its psychologically unrealistic reliance on sympathy as the primary basis of moral learning and moral motivation, that might be viewed as idealized in a way that limits its applicability to our real-world situation. By contrast, there's no reason we cannot use Rawls's moral psychology to help illuminate our actual situation, for that psychology characterizes human motivation in non-ideal, no less than in ideal conditions. If we therefore assume, in a Rawlsian spirit, that the stability of just institutions, whether under ideal or non-ideal conditions, requires that they cohere with the psychology of reciprocity, and if such coherence is most fully achieved when social institutions manifestly affirm in their policies and priorities the good of all citizens, then what are we to say about the United States in the decades preceding the election of Donald Trump? There are, of course, many things we might say. We might ask, for example, about the steep rise during that period in so-called deaths of despair among working-class whites with only a high school degree or less, which has been documented by Ann Case and Angus Deaton. Or we might ask about the emergence of the Black Lives Matter movement as a response to persistent patterns of violence, especially, but not exclusively, police violence against black people. Is the shocking rise in midlife mortality among poor and working-class whites an indication that the basic structure of American society manifestly affirms the good of those citizens? Are the persistent patterns of violence and racism directed against black Americans a sign that an affirmation of their good is inscribed in the fundamental priorities and policies of America's major political and social institutions? These questions answer themselves. There are many other questions we could ask about the growing influence of money on the political process, or about the rising cost of a college education and the obstacle it presents to achieving fair equality of opportunity. But perhaps it's sufficient to take note of the skyrocketing economic inequality that characterized American society during the years in question. Rawls's claim that his principles embody an ideal of reciprocity rests heavily, though not exclusively, on the fact that his difference principle requires economic inequalities to be arranged in such a way as to maximize the position of the worst-off group in society. Robert Nozick once asked, in objecting to the difference principle, how we would feel about a principle, we might call it the reverse difference principle, that required inequalities to be arranged in such a way as to maximize the position of the best-off group. Nozick's mischievous question was a fanciful hypothetical that was intended to cast doubt on the strength of Rawls's argument for the difference principle. But if one looks at patterns of inequality in the United States in recent decades, it's difficult to avoid the conclusion that the basic structure of American society has come closer to satisfying Nozick's reverse difference principle than it has to satisfying Rawls's original difference principle. That is, the inequalities fostered by America's institutions have come closer to maximizing the position of the best-off group than to maximizing the position of the worst-off group. I'm sure there will be some who want to dispute the observations I've made about the character of American society in recent decades. That's fair enough, but I won't try to engage such objections here. Instead, I'll simply state my conclusion, which is that the United States in recent decades has egregiously failed to live up to any reasonable standard of reciprocity because its institutions and policies have blatantly failed to affirm the good of all citizens. If that's correct, and if, as Rawls maintains, the stability of otherwise just institutions depends on their embodying an idea of reciprocity, then what we should have expected to see as a consequence of those failures is just what we have in fact seen in recent years: growing resentment, discord, and the degrading and destabilizing of liberal institutions. Of course, the situation is in one respect worse than this might suggest. Rawls's point was about the stability of otherwise just institutions, or more accurately, it was about whether a candidate theory of justice could generate its own support if it didn't meet the standard of reciprocity. But the pre-Trump United States failed to meet that standard, not because it was attempting to realize a utilitarian theory of justice that relied more heavily on sympathy than reciprocity, and not because it was attempting to satisfy any serious theory of justice at all, but simply because it was allowing or encouraging the wealthy and the privileged to prosper at the expense of everyone else. And if even utilitarianism, which genuinely seeks to advance the general welfare, contains the seeds of instability because it fails to satisfy the conditions of reciprocity, then what are we to say about institutions that fail to satisfy those conditions because they neglect the worst off and allow the wealthiest to amass almost unimaginable riches? What we can say is that they provide fertile conditions for the emergence of a candidate and a president like Donald Trump. Two caveats. First, in 2016, approximately 60% of eligible Americans actually voted, according to the most recent estimates I've seen. Of those, about 48% voted for Hillary Clinton, while about 46% voted for Donald Trump. So almost 3/4 of eligible U.S. voters did not vote for Trump. Of the slightly more than 1/4 of eligible voters who did cast ballots for him, many were presumably reliable Republicans who would have voted for more or less anyone the Republicans nominated. The reasons that moved the remainder to support Trump were no doubt various, and the relative importance of different reasons has been much debated. Most of the controversy has focused on the respective roles of economic anxiety and the fear of cultural displacement as factors that led voters to support Trump. In my own decidedly non-expert opinion, those two factors are closely intertwined, and I doubt whether they can be neatly disentangled, especially since Trump, following in the footsteps of many of his Republican predecessors, worked assiduously to convert even legitimate economic grievances into poisonous social animosities. However, the only claim I wish to make is that the sustained failure of American institutions to satisfy any reasonable standard of reciprocity, and especially their embrace of staggering levels of inequality, created or contributed to conditions in which attitudes of grievance, anger, and resentment, not all of them unreasonable, flourished among enough voters to enable a candidate like Trump, who exploited those attitudes to great political advantage, to be successful. The second caveat is this. It wasn't inevitable that Donald Trump in particular would be the electoral beneficiary of those attitudes. The unexpected success of Bernie Sanders, who addressed some of the same attitudes of grievance and anger as Trump did, suggests that the attitudes in question were to some degree malleable. They were liable to be articulated in different ways and channeled in different directions, some more constructive and some less so. Indeed, some of the people who voted for Sanders in the primaries, 12% according to two widely reported surveys, voted for Trump in the general election, and their influence was especially significant in the crucial states of Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan. Trump was, one might almost say, Bernie Sanders' evil twin, and as has been widely remarked, it's perhaps the final irony of his victory that he's likely to do so little to address the legitimate grievances of those of his supporters whose interests have been neglected in recent decades. Given the political importance of reciprocity, it's telling that Trump himself uses the language of fairness and reciprocity so frequently. According to the New York Times, the word reciprocal is, quote, one of Mr. Trump's favorite terms. Again, this obviously does not mean that Trump is a Rawlsian or that he's likely to move America closer to satisfying an ideal of reciprocity. Far from it. What Rawls himself teaches us is that serious and sustained violations of reciprocity are likely to produce a destabilizing backlash. However, the form of the backlash is unpredictable, and the resentments inspired by sustained inequality are just as likely to be stoked and exploited by unscrupulous and demagogic forces as they are to be marshaled effectively to achieve greater social justice. What Trump's case reminds us is that the demagogue's toolkit may include the cynical appropriation of the language of fairness and reciprocity to express a narcissist's grandiose sense of grievance and to provide a fig leaf for the cultivation of group animosities and, in the worst case, the legitimation of violence. If that happens, then, as Rawls says in a different context, quote, the moral quality of political life will change in ways that are obvious and require no comment. So to return to the issue with which I began, does the recent rise in authoritarianism reveal flaws in liberal theory? I've argued with special reference to the United States that there's ample room for liberals to deploy what I call the generic defensive strategy. They can insist that pre-Trump America did not remotely live up to the requirements of the most defensible versions of liberal theory, so that its failures were not the failures of those versions. Rawls's theory also provides the basis for a plausible diagnosis from the standpoint of liberalism itself of the failures of American institutions in the pre-Trump era and of the conditions that enabled Trump to win the American presidency. Accordingly, Trump's success is entirely consistent with what liberal theory would lead one to expect. To that extent, it vindicates rather than undermines the theory. But it must be said, only to that extent. As I noted earlier, the generic defensive strategy is not fully satisfying because there remains a question about the degree to which the assessment of a political theory can legitimately remain unaffected by the failures of sustained attempts to realize it in practice. And the availability of the Rawlsian diagnosis of contemporary America's failures does not settle this question either. So the residual issue for liberal theory is this. If liberal theories fail over an extended period of time to achieve just and stable political orders that meet a reasonable standard of reciprocity, then do we nevertheless have good reason to think or to hope that such orders are politically achievable with sufficient effort? Or should we worry that the most attractive forms of liberalism may be unsustainable in practice? A decisive political repudiation of the turn toward authoritarianism and a sharp reversal of the profoundly inegalitarian direction of recent American society would provide grounds for optimism not only about the future of the country, but also about the viability of liberalism as a political philosophy. Thanks.
All righty. So my talk title today is called Against Abjection. Now, I think I'm among the small number of speakers who never had the pleasure and honor of meeting John Rawls. So for me, Rawls has just been a sparring partner, an intellectual sparring partner over time, not somebody from whom I feel that I inherited something and have a legacy to work through, but rather somebody from whom I've learned immeasurably, but also have argued with persistently. And so when Michael gave me this lovely invitation, I decided to use this occasion to get something off my chest. So that's your warning. So, however, in having this morning an argument again with Rawls, I hope to do that in a spirit of reciprocity. And so therefore want to start by just being very clear about the things that I do admire deeply about Rawls. Two Concepts of Rules just is one of my favorite essays of all time, period. Hands down, competing with my favorites, Plato, Aristotle, etc. Love Two Concepts of Rules. I deeply admire Rawls's commitment to the sacredness of human personality, to quote King's phrase, sacredness of human personality. And I use that phrase intentionally. Jeffrey Stout at Princeton has taught me to think of or understand the word sacred as one that does not necessarily connote religion. It can, but it also can be a secular term, meaning things that you hold of immense value and build institutions, rituals, and structures around in order to solidify that valuation. And that, in that regard, the word sacred sort of does some of the work that we saw in the conversation about Rawls yesterday of both capturing the way in which there is some sort of layer of his early engagement with Christian theology in his work, but there is also a clear break from that and a clear project of secularization. I admire the comprehensive and systematic nature of his thought, and I also admire his profound rhetorical insight, which is not something that he typically gets credit for. But theory of justice is masterfully constructed, and I do believe that some significant portion of its influence, I mean, obviously the philosophy explains in itself the influence, but the rhetorical construction, the literary style, the decision to give people up front a compact conclusion of the argument and then to unfold its underpinnings all the way through to the end is also a part of the reason for its success. So my argument with Rawls comes in relationship, well, in a few different places, but today, in relationship to the concept of reciprocity, which I do, losing control of my PowerPoint here, which I do take to be at the core of the theory, just as we've heard from our two other speakers earlier this morning. And I want to just start by reminding us, these are things you already know, of just where reciprocity fits into the theory. So in the first instance, the original position requirement of the principle of the basic liberties is itself something that is closely connected to the principle of reciprocity. This requirement is essential. It is, or what a few ways of capturing it are: it's essential that the priority of liberty be firmly maintained, and one thing that it achieves is the public affirmation of the status of equal citizenship for all. That came up yesterday in the first talk. Alongside that first principle of justice and its derivation from the original position, we get to a similar place on the basis of reciprocity coming out of a supposedly realist account of motivation. So this is the psychological account that Sam just walked us through. In a well-ordered state, human development will generate reciprocity. Reciprocity will provide the ground for the commitment to basic liberties, and that's where we get the stability argument. It's not sympathy, but reciprocity that gives us stability. This is based on laws of psychology, and I think of this as a kind of the realist strand of Rawls's argument that works in complementary relationship with the a priori or original position requirement. And the combination of the original position derived principle and this psychology is the argument works to deliver a primary good, namely the primary good of self-respect. All right, so it's a very tight, coherent argument. We could visualize it in this way, that good family experience generates reciprocity, combined with the principles derived from the original position in the form of support for public affirmation of equal citizen status should deliver self-respect enabled for others and for oneself. All right, and with that phrase, excuse me, with that phrase, I'm extending the idea of self-respect and being more clear about what Rawls says about it routinely. In common parlance, when we invoke the concept of self-respect, we typically have our own self-respect in mind. But in Rawls's argument, the first thing that he often is talking about is the fact that in affirming the equal citizen status of others, what we do is enable self-respect for others. Okay? So it's not sort of common parlance use of the idea of self-respect, and I'm actually going to end up focusing on that. Let me just remind you of some of the texts that support those three pieces of that core, as I've described it. So from latent theory of justice, for that basic liberties requirement, the best solution is to support the primary good of self-respect as far as possible by the assignment of the basic liberties that can indeed be made equal, defining the same status for all. At the same time, distributive justice is frequently understood. Distributive justice is frequently understood, justice in the relative shares of material means is relegated to a subordinate place. Thus, we arrive at another reason for factoring the social order into two parts, as indicated by the principle of justice. While these principles permit inequalities in return for contributions that are for the benefit of all, the precedence of liberty entails equality in the social bases of esteem. Okay. And then just to remind you about the reciprocity argument, its connection to psychology. The principles of moral psychology also receive some discussion. I emphasize the fact that they are reciprocity principles and connect this with the question of relative stability. That was Sam's argument just now. Once the powers of understanding mature and persons come to recognize their place in society and are able to take up the standpoint of others, they appreciate the mutual benefits of establishing fair terms of social cooperation. We have a natural sympathy with other persons and an innate susceptibility to the pleasures of fellow feeling and self-mastery. And these provide the effective basis for the moral sentiments once we have a clear grasp of our relations to our associates from an appropriately general perspective. And then in summary, for the theory of right and justice is founded on the notion of reciprocity, which reconciles the points of view of the self and of others as equal moral persons. I take this to be part of Stephen's argument about accountability earlier. This reciprocity has the consequence that both perspectives characterize moral thought and feeling, usually in roughly even measure. Neither concern for others nor for self has priority, for all are equal, and the balance between persons is given by the principles of justice. And for the delivery of self-respect, now our self-respect normally depends upon the respect of others. Unless we feel that our endeavors are honored by them, it is difficult, if not impossible, for us to maintain the conviction that our ends are worth advancing. Thus, a desirable feature of a conception of justice is that it should publicly express men's respect for one another. In this way, they ensure a sense of their own value. Now, the two principles achieve this end. And toward the end, as we have noted, a more unconditional caring for our good and a clearer refusal by others to take advantage of accident and happenstance must strengthen our self-esteem. In a well-ordered society, then, self-respect is secured by the public affirmation of the status of equal citizenship for all. Okay. So, all this seems very coherent. But in my view, what I want to argue today is that the conception of self-respect has gone wrong. It's a very abject conception of self-respect. And to start with cases that work against it, I would use the examples of slavery and of low-status workers in a way opposite to that of Rawls. That is, both categories of people certainly are put in a low-status position in non-ideal societies in which they find themselves. And that does not actually determine their degree of self-respect. It is entirely possible for a low-wage worker or somebody in slavery to respect themselves, to understand their own basic worth. And the achievement of that self-respect does not depend on a grant from others. So let me give you Ralph Ellison on that subject. In 1963, The World in the Jug, he's part of the same intellectual milieu as Rawls, but I don't think they ever met or interacted. I could escape the reduction imposed by unjust laws and customs, but not that imposed by ideas, which define me as no more than the sum of those laws and customs. I learned to outmaneuver those who interpreted my silence as submission, my efforts at self-control as fear, my contempt as awe before superior status, my dreams of faraway places and room at the top of the heap as defeat before the barriers of their stifling provincial world. And my struggle became a desperate battle which was usually fought, though not always, in silence. A guerrilla action in a larger war in which I found some of the most treacherous assaults against me, committed by those who regarded themselves either as neutrals, as sympathizers, or as disinterested military advisors. I recall this not in complaint, for thus I was disciplined, a word I'll come back to endure the absurdities of both conscious and unconscious prejudice, to resist racial provocation, and before the ready violence of brutal policemen, railroad bulls, and casual white citizens, to hold my peace and bide my time. Thus was I forced to evaluate my own self-worth and the narrow freedom in which it existed against the power of those who would destroy me. In time I was to leave the South, although it has never left me, and the interests which I discovered there became my life. What Ellison articulates here, I think, is a Stoic conception of self-respect. And as it happens, Stoicism is a sort of form of ancient philosophy that typically is seen as not having many in the way of modern advocates or modern espousers. We have modern Aristotelians, we have modern Kantians. We think we don't have many modern Stoics, but I actually think the tradition of African-American political thought does deliver a form of contemporary Stoicism for consideration. And the particular nature of the Stoicism is one that's reflected in a couple of rituals in the African-American community. You may have heard jokes about the talk. This is a joke that people bring up in the context of thinking about police brutality, so to connect to another theme of Sam's, that every African-American child, regardless of their class position, has the talk about how you interact with the police. Every African-American parent gives this talk to their children. It's very simple. Don't talk back to the police. Okay, that's the talk. There's a little bit more to it than that, but that's the core. Okay? And just as there is that talk about the police, there is also a talk about self-respect. Okay, and you can think of that one as captured primarily by the concept, black is beautiful. Now, you might say that the fact that people have to have that talk is empirical evidence in support of the notion that self-respect depends on others, but that's not the case. It is evidence in support of the fact that self-respect is affected by others, but not that it depends on others. It is, in fact, possible to build self-respect from a position of independence. And Ellison describes that work as work of discipline. He describes it in talking later in an argument with Hannah Arendt as the discipline that African-American parents give their children in teaching them to master fear and anger. The language of Stoicism, not the sort of names of Stoics, but the sort of conceptual terms of Stoicism appear throughout. And the result of this, Ellison thinks, is a discipline which these heavy thinkers, he's thinking of literary critics like Irving Howe, would not undergo even if guaranteed that combined with their own heritage, it would make them the freest of spirits, the wisest of men, and the most sublime of heroes. So Ellison is claiming for this Stoic discipline the production of a form of self-respect that achieves the freedom of the freest spirit, of the wisest man, the most sublime of heroes. Okay, so my suggestion is that in comparison to that conception of self-respect as articulated by Ellison's, Rawls has delivered us an abject conception of self-respect, and that we ought to reject it. Is that fair? How abject really is Rawls's conception? Let's just remind ourselves again of some of the core passages. This is a question for me. I read it as abject, but maybe I'm reading it incorrectly. So I'm going to share some of the passages and invite you to engage around them. Thus, to respect another as a moral person is to try to understand his aims and interests from his standpoint and to present him with considerations that enable him to accept the constraints on his conduct. Since another wishes, let us suppose, to regulate his actions on the basis of principles to which all could agree, he should be acquainted with the relevant facts which explain the restrictions in this way. Also, respect is shown in a willingness to do small favors and courtesies, not because they are of any material value, but because they are an appropriate expression of our awareness of another person's feelings and aspirations. Now, the reason why this duty would be acknowledged is that although the parties in this original position take no interest in each other's interests, they know that in society they need to be assured by the esteem of their associates. From the point of view of African American experiences, I know it, that is an extremely dangerous idea. Their self-respect and their confidence in the value of their own system of ends cannot withstand the indifference, much less the contempt of others. In fact, it can. Everyone benefits then from living in a society where the duty of mutual respect is honored. That is true. But we have to reconsider, I think, the nature of the benefit. The cost to self-interest is minor in comparison with the support for the sense of one's own worth. Okay. Or another one. Surely it is natural to experience a loss of self-esteem, a weakening of our sense of the value of accomplishing our aims, when we must accept a lesser prospect of life for the sake of others. In this instance, he's talking about utilitarianism then. Men's self-esteem hinges on how they regard one another. If the parties accept utility criterion, they will lack the support to their self-respect provided by the public commitment of others to arrange inequalities to everyone's advantage and to guarantee an equal liberty for all. In a public utilitarian society, men will find it more difficult to be confident of their own worth. All right. I do think it's abject. Again, I invite you to give me a different reading, but I think it assumes a dependence on others for self-respect that it is not necessary to assume. All right, then. So, nonetheless, as I was reading the long passage, I said, in respect to the remark, everyone benefits then from living in a society where the duty of mutual respect is honored, that is true. I think it is true. But what exactly then is delivered by reciprocity and by mutual respect? That's the question I want to dig into now. In other words, I don't think that what reciprocity delivers is self-respect for everybody. I think reciprocity delivers something else. But what? So to answer this question, I want to spend a minute thinking again about a debate between Hannah Arendt and Ralph Ellison that I've written about in the past. And this was their argument about Little Rock and the effort of African-American teenagers to integrate the schools in Little Rock, Arkansas in 1957. Arendt wrote a very famous essay called Reflections on Little Rock, in which she criticized the parents of the African-American children for, she thought that they were instrumentalizing their children in order to secure social advancement. she got the history wrong. The children themselves had autonomously chosen, teenagers, to pursue integration. Parents, for the most part, were actually against their doing this because they were worried about their kids' safety, but they respected their children's choices and supported them in their effort. And as Arendt and Ellison have this debate, one of the points Ellison makes is that Arendt does not understand this discipline of mastering fear and anger, which explains how and why African Americans are able to pursue this kind of political strategy. But the core of their debate, too, is about what is being pursued. So Hannah Arendt, many have analyzed this essay in terms of some of her writing about the concept of the parvenu. And she herself had a very strong rejection of the notion that one should count for one's self-esteem, for one's social esteem on others. So she thought people should maintain their independent sense of self, not seek social approbation from those who had expressed negative views about them. And to some extent, she's imputing to the African-American parents a failure to maintain that kind of non-abject sense of self that I've just been describing. So one of the paradoxes for me over the course of my own intellectual journey is that although I argued vociferously against Arendt's positions, sort of 13, 14, 15 years ago about Little Rock, I have come to think that she's right in this core concern about definitions of self-respect that are tied to abjection. However, here I think she's misunderstood how a non-abject conception of self-respect is operating in Ellison's arguments and in the case of the African-American experience. So just to remind you of the scene of this set of events, the key thing here is that when the Little Rock Nine sought to integrate Little Rock, they were not seeking social affirmation or approbation. They were seeking simply the removal of barriers to freedom. And the thing that Arendt failed to understand was precisely that failures of reciprocity, to Sam's point, produce unfreedoms. Ellison described himself as evaluating his own self-worth, taking responsibility for it, within the confines of a narrow freedom. His self-respect was not diminished by the experience of segregation, but the scope of his freedom was diminished. So in pursuing integration and in pursuing social reciprocity in schools, what African Americans were pursuing was an end to the treatment of the disadvantaged as a vehicle for the self-disgust of the advantaged. I'll come back to that phrase in a moment. That's Ellison. And removal of a barrier to freedom in the form of relational discrimination or domination. Okay? So let me just give you a little bit more Ellison here. One of the most insidious crimes occurring in this democracy is that of designating another, politically weaker, less socially acceptable people as a receptacle for one's own self-disgust, for one's own infantile rebellions, from one's own fears of and retreats from reality. Now, this connects to Stephen's arguments about shame and guilt. Failures of self-respect, the failure to respect another, doesn't damage the self-respect of the other. It produces shame and guilt in the person who fails to adhere to the moral norm of reciprocity. In Ellison's argument, that shame and guilt generates this treatment of the disadvantaged as the vehicle for that shame and guilt, scapegoating process. And Ellison used that vocabulary of scapegoating a lot. All right, but it's important to recognize that the harm done, the damage done, the violence done to social relationship by a violation of reciprocity harms the doer of the deed. Okay? It's a failure in their own moral constitution, their bases for self-respect and self-esteem, but not necessarily does it impose that same harm on the recipient of the deed. That is not to say there are no injuries done, but the relevant injury is not one to self-respect and self-worth. Okay. So, what I've been arguing is that we do need reciprocity to establish freedom, not to establish self-respect for one another. So we need good family experience, we need that psychological basis for reciprocity, and we want that to complement a public affirmation of equal citizen status, but the result should be a principle that I have named difference without domination. Right? That is to say, the ability to work in social relations in ways that don't limit the freedom of others. I have an essay on the subject. I'm not going to go through the details of it right now. The point is just to say that what is delivered by reciprocity is, again, not respect, but the social basis of freedom. And what matters to me in this phrase is the idea of the social basis of freedom specifically. So that is, what is delivered by reciprocity is specifically that feature of the relational element of our collective lives that supports freedom. So as distinct from the economic element or the institutional and legal element. And this also connects to Stephen's points about relationality not being an object of distribution. It's of a different kind, and consequently, I would argue, requires its own principle. So I actually think that sort of correction of the Rawlsian framework requires setting alongside protection of the basic liberties and the difference principle, also adherence to a principle that I would call difference without domination, which is adherence to the principle of reciprocity, but where one recognizes that in acting with reciprocity to others, one's not enabling the conditions of their self-respect, but preserving one's own self-respect and enabling conditions of freedom, social freedom, for others around you. Okay, so I'm going to give you one last word from Ellison. They're harsh words, okay? So let me apologize up front for them, for their harshness. But I think they're worth hearing, again, because this is about a conversation that was happening in the 1960s and 1970s. And it's important, I think, to remember that Rawls's arguments are part of that context, and Ellison's was one voice responding to them then. So back to one of Rawls's claims about self-esteem and self-respect. Surely it is natural to experience a loss of self-esteem, a weakening of our sense of the value of accomplishing our aims, when we must accept a lesser prospect of life for the sake of others. All right, so now your handout is what I take to be Ellison's answer to a claim of that kind. And this comes from an essay, The World and the Jug, which he wrote in response to criticisms of his novel Invisible Man by the critic Irving Howe. It was an exchange that played out in dissent, so it was part of that world, intellectual world of dissent, political philosophy, and so forth. But having left the South, I did not leave the battle, for how could I leave Howe? Sorry, Ellison loves word games. He is a man of words and ideas, and since I too find my identity in the world of ideas and words, where would I flee? I still endure the nonsense of fools with a certain patience, but when a respected critic distorts my situation in order to feel comfortable in the abstractions he would impose upon American reality, then it is indeed in accordance with my nature to protest. Ideas are important in themselves, perhaps, but when they are interposed between me and my sense of reality, I feel threatened. They are too elusive, they move with missile speed, and are too often fired from altitudes rising high above the cluttered terrain upon which I struggle. And too often, those with a facility for ideas find themselves in the councils of power, representing me at the double distance of racial alienation and inexperience. Taking leave of Howe for a moment, for his lapse is merely symptomatic, let me speak generally. Many of those who write of Negro life today seem to assume that as long as their hearts are in their right place, they can be as arbitrary as they wish in their formulations. Others seem to feel that they can air with impunity their most private Freudian fantasies as long as they are given the slightest camouflage of intellectuality and projected as Negro. They have made of the no man's land created by segregation a territory for infantile self-expression and intellectual anarchy. They write as though Negro life exists only in light of their belated regard, and they publish interpretations of Negro experience which would not hold true for their own or for any other form of human life. Here, the basic unity of human experience that assures us of some possibility of empathic and symbolic identification with those of other backgrounds is blasted in the interest of specious political and philosophical conceits. Prefabricated Negroes are sketched on sheets of paper and superimposed upon the Negro community. Then when someone thrusts his head through the page and yells, "Watch out there, Jack! There are people living under here," they are shocked and indignant. I don't think it's actually Jack Rawls he means, but it works nicely. Let's see. Most Negroes recognize themselves as themselves despite what others might believe them to be. And then for Ellison, what counted as abjection was passing. Okay, so then we get a criticism of passing. Thus, although the sociologists tell us that thousands of light-skinned Negroes become white each year undetected, most Negroes can spot a paper-thin white Negro every time simply because those who masquerade missed what others were forced to pick up along the way. Discipline. A discipline which these heavy thinkers would not undergo, even if guaranteed that combined with their own heritage, it would make them the freest of spirits, the wisest of men, and the most sublime of heroes. I profoundly admire Rawls. I am profoundly grateful for the chance to argue with him. Thank you.
So I'll invite the speakers to come up. That was a very interesting and rich panel. And I'll take just a moment to respond very briefly to each to each talk by raising a question about our understanding or their understanding of Rawls's political liberalism, the political form of liberalism. So I want to start by connecting the emergence of the notion of persons as self-authenticating sources of claims in the later works of Rawls with his shift to a political form of liberalism, where a person's valid claims on institutions are understood to derive not from the form or content of a person's moral commitments or social position or social role, but instead derive directly from a person's equal membership status, the same equal membership status that all members of society ideally should have, and that grounds each person's claim on an important set of basic rights, liberties, and opportunities and material goods. So, moving on to the second talk, emphasizing this political interpretation of the idea of a person as a self-authenticating source of claims, we would expect, and I think Sam Schefller is right, that a deprivation of treatment as a person with that status would cause certain damage to a society's culture and institutional framework in particular, and at an individual level, people's experience of how they're treated in the society may be to cause for individual persons both a sense of bitterness and resentment as a response to the perception and experience of unfulfilled needs, an erosion of people's disposition to recognize other people in a mutual way. So the erosion of a kind of ethic of mutual recognition. I think he's right about that. And to erode the social bases of self-respect that I would like to propose an interpretation of that acknowledges, I think, the revision that you have suggested that we think about in interpreting Rawls's notion while still acknowledging the important role that it plays in his philosophy. I think that the erosion of both a person's receipt of just claims in a society and the erosion of the social structure that enables the possibility of mutual recognition that a healthy, just society needs is at odds with a person's placing their own sense of self-esteem and dignity it places a person's self-esteem and dignity at odds with the possibility of that person accepting constraints on their own behavior that would be imposed by the basic structure of society. So it sets up, rather than a kind of mutual support of a person's sense of self-esteem and dignity with the requirements imposed on them and restrictions imposed on them of the basic structure of society, it puts them in conflict. So rather than saying, I'm suggesting, you may or may not agree, that it diminishes a person's self-esteem, it puts a person's self-esteem at odds with the claims that the society's basic structure is making on them, pushing them into a position of protest for the sake of maintaining their self-esteem against their society. So I guess I would just stop there and invite any of the speakers on this panel, not expecting you all to speak to this if you don't wish to comment on the political nature of these values and how we might understand them within Rawls's philosophy, to kind of push him to be deep about his commitment to the idea of a political form of liberalism. And we are opening the discussion also to the audience, but I give each of you a chance to make a comment if you so wish to.
Well, maybe I'll just start. I think one way of linking together a theme in all three talks that also links to this idea of the political turn is to start with what Sam was saying about sympathy versus reciprocity. Okay, so you might think, well, gee, sympathy, and then saying that manifestly our society hasn't affirmed the equal good of all, right? Well, you might say, well, there's this way in which utilitarianism affirms the equal good of all. So, I mean, that in a way defines utilitarianism. But I take it the difference between reciprocity as fundamental and the utilitarian principle as fundamental is reciprocity is essentially public in a way that the utilitarian idea need not be. So reciprocity has to do with the terms on which we will relate to one another. And this, I think, comes up with something that was in play a little bit yesterday about where does the publicity requirement come from? Because it's kind of an add-on from a utilitarian perspective. It's essential, of course, to the argument from the original position, but I think that's what's justifying that is this idea, you could call it a deep ideal of reciprocity, but reciprocity understood as reciprocal recognition of one another as equal sources of claims. And that has to do with how we will relate to one another, on what terms we'll relate to one another. And those have to be common terms. They have to be in the public culture. And so it seems to me now getting, well, it's to the point of abjection. Let's grant that having one's self-esteem or self-respect subject to or dependent upon how one's related to by others is abject. But I think there the problem is conceiving of self-esteem or self-respect as a good that is we get in society from others, it's vulnerable to others, versus self-respect as itself the response to our value, our fundamental value as a source of claims. So I think there's a way of relating these various thoughts.
And I would agree with that, and I appreciate that last formulation. I mean, that I had hoped to spend a little bit more time on that concept, but I do think not thinking of self-respect as one of the primary social goods is key to rectifying this mistake. That doesn't mean it's not a good. It is absolutely good.
Yeah.
Right, it's not social good. It's affected by social things, absolutely, but it's not entirely social good. And I think I would want to add your arguments about morality as equal accountability into the picture here, which I think picks up with Sam's argument as well, in the sense that, so I asked this question, so what does reciprocity deliver? What I think it delivers the social bases of freedom, but I'm not wedded to that. I actually don't know the answer to that question. That's why I asked it as a question. Okay, so I'm trying to answer that question. It seems to me one could say that what reciprocity delivers is, in fact, mutual accountability. And in that mutual accountability, you help secure the conditions for freedom alongside the work that laws and institutions do. And so that then, with regard to your analysis, precisely what fell out, and which is quite different from a utilitarian picture, was any sort of process of mutual holding to account, right? And that was sort of what disappeared. So deaths of despair, in some sense, emerge at a point where there's ceased to be any holding to account of one another, but particularly those who are experiencing advantage in that particular moment.
If it's not cheating, could I ask Danielle a question about, at this point, because I think there's clearly something right and important about what you said, and about the limits or the in Rawls's claim about self-respect depending on the respect of others. It's a striking fact that many people seem to be able to retain their self-respect under conditions of great adversity, where the conditions of adversity include the widespread contempt of the society around them. But I have two questions, and I wonder whether they might sort of narrow the gap in a way between your position and his. And they really are questions. One is, to what extent do the people who do that, who are able to maintain their self-respect under those conditions, nevertheless benefit from the solidarity that they experience by virtue of belonging to a community bound by ties of solidarity? Yeah. So they do benefit from the respect of others. It's just not the wider society, but it's a community of respect they belong to, you might say, and that nurtures their self-respect. It's a little harder to think of a purely solitary, I'm in no position to say it's impossible, but somebody who is like disrespected by everyone. I mean, everyone, but they respect themselves. So to what that might suggest that the problem is with the others, that it's not being made specific. It may not depend on the respect of everybody in the society. And I wonder whether you think that's right or not. The second question is, if Rawls hadn't said depends on the respect of others, but if he said is enhanced by the respect of others.
And sometimes he does, in all fairness.
Right.
Yeah.
Would you still think that it was an abject conception?
Let me start with the second one because I think it's easier. I think I wouldn't actually. So I'm absolutely would endorse the affected by. It sometimes uses language as strengthened by, et cetera. And I think that is just empirically true. There's all kinds of psychology that supports that, and as you go back to Mead and Honish and people like that, so there's a sort of strong, clear case there. It is the dependence claim to which I'm objecting, and trying to propose an alternative. So with regard to the former, now I mean then so the former is sort of also an empirical question. It's clearly, self-respect is easier to build, secure, et cetera, in healthy social conditions. Then the question of whether or not the isolated person can do it depends on where you want to fall on a sort of set of potential philosophical traditions. So there'd be some kind of versions of Stoicism that say, yes, it is possible for the individual. But I think this actually in an interesting way relates to one of the points made by Kenzie yesterday when she said that, if I can remember this properly, that in that sort of early Rawls essay, there was a concern with political philosophies that focused on power and the expression of human power, because this was a hubristic thing. It was sort of power actually sort of comes from God, and to take it as a human project is hubristic. And in a funny way, another tradition where you would get a sort of strong sense of self-respect, even in sort of persecution, absolute isolation, right, would be a Christian tradition, which would say it's because you recognize that you are created by God or whatever else that your question of your own worth is just there's never any question, right? And so then there's a kind of similar view that to make that question of worth dependent on sociality at all is hubristic in the same way that making power sort of purely dependent on human capacities might be hubristic. That would be one way of possibly thinking about it.
All right, so I'm just going to go roughly in the order. In the middle, there in the back.
And I should say, thanks for letting me get that off my chest. I've been on my chest for a while, that one. So.
Thanks very much. Andrew March, Harvard Middle East Initiative, and UMass Political Science. I suspect I'll be the first of most questions directed to Danielle, and I hope I'm not repeating what Steve and Sam just said. So it was profoundly illuminating, and I think the idea that I think what you just clarified, that if it's a metaphysical claim that self-respect is impossible without some kind of recognition of the other, that is something that we want to profoundly reject, and that this last quote that you put of Ellison speaking back to Howe and noting that even a kind of appropriation of his words and what he's trying to say is a profound kind of harm to what he was doing. And so I think this idea that the African-American political tradition, having sort of reflected on conditions of respect, conditions of agency, community, and so forth, is something that should absolutely be presented to political philosophy as much as possible. But I'm wondering if we did this, and we are, isn't it precisely one of the main things that's learned from opening up political philosophy beyond a kind of analytic or liberal or white liberal perspective, how profoundly important questions of self-respect are, and questions of respect are. So looking beyond Ellison's really, really demanding, and he uses the word heroic conception of Stoicism, which we know is the most demanding possible ethical conception, we get Du Bois's conception of double consciousness. We get a profound understanding of the many, many ways in which a society that's based on white supremacy, society that's based on racism, society that's based on all these hierarchies is not just material deprivation. It's deprivation to a public conception of harm. And you also, I think, get the sense of why this has to be so public, right? So these things that you were mentioning about Black is beautiful and all of these sorts of things, these are not just internal conversations, and they're certainly not just individual conversations, but they are relentlessly presented to the broader white supremacist public sphere. And for some reason, that appears to be important, right? You get other, Baldwin, of course, is the last person that's going to say Black self-respect.
We have quite a few questions.
Yeah, very, very. So I'm saying, so how would we not derive from this precisely a sense that what the public sphere is supposed to be doing, what the basic structure is doing, is contributing some way into a minimization of the way in which these emotional and psychological burdens are unfairly distributed?
Right, yes, no, so I want to just repeat. So everyone benefits from living in a society where the duty of mutual respect is honored. So I 100% agree with Rawls about that. And then, as I said, simply wanted to rethink the nature of the benefit. So I think, yes, I mean, a lot of the kind of public discourse around how we value different people, how we value each other, how we value ourselves, is about trying to achieve a point where there is that commitment to mutual respect is honored, right? So in other words, it's, to what degree, I would say, so is that work done in order to avoid an injury to self-respect? Or is that work done in order to secure freedom and opportunity? It's done to secure freedom and opportunity.
Yeah, Rainer Forst from Frankfurt. Danielle, along these lines, I think you're absolutely right, and I think the criticism holds even more against Hegelian ideas of struggles for recognition, assuming that you achieve self-respect by after the struggle, and forgetting that in order to engage in the struggle, you need to have self-respect to start with. But two things. Is Stoic the right term for that? The Stoic retreats from the social battles and struggles into an ataraxia, where he or she tries to remain aloof from whether it's natural disaster, social injustice, and whatsoever. So the term Stoic is a bit irritating. The second, as we know,
Getting it off your chest, huh?
as we know from a lot of analysis of social struggles against injustice, a lot of the things people like Ellison or Gramsci and others struggle against is the sense of alienation within their own group of people who don't consider themselves worthy of equal standing. Doesn't that attest to the social dynamics that Rawls has in mind? Precisely that their struggle is also one against the alienation within their own group.
So on the first point, it's both regrettable and beneficial that Stoicism is a pretty big tent. And so you can certainly take Cicero. There's a sort of Stoic who had a struggle-oriented conception of ataraxia. So anyway, so I am relying on the big tentedness of Stoicism. With regard to the second question, I would agree, and so that's what I said. I mean, there's clear empirical basis for understanding that our self-conceptions are socially constituted, and so if there are harms to that social constitution, it would not be surprising that they should manifest in the form of degradations to self-respect or self-esteem. The question is, sort of, what's the solution to that? I don't think that solution should rest in the hands of the polity. And this is sort of a little bit back to your question, and it's a point about political liberalism. So what are the limits of what we can do politically? And I would say, actually, yes, we want to establish an ethic of mutual respect, but we do that because it supports the bases of freedom. And then whether people achieve their own self-respect or not, certainly it gets easier in that regard, but they get the credit for that achievement. It hasn't been provided to them.
Paul Weithman, Notre Dame. One question for Stephen and one for Danielle. The question for Stephen is about the claim that the Dewey lectures add something new in appealing to the idea of people as self-originating sources of valued claims, and something new that we really need to get a deontology going. So from the very beginning of theory of justice, Rawls says that the role of principles is to adjudicate conflicting claims on the social product. And so you might think that the idea of that people can make claims and can therefore be wronged is in the book from the very beginning, from the very opening pages. It's not surprising that the Kantian interpretation does what you say it does, because I think the Kantian interpretation, that section, is to establish premises Rawls subsequently needs to show congruence. And so it's natural that the Kantian interpretation, or that section of the book, should be to establish claims about the good rather than the right, because he's subsequently going to draw on those claims later in the book to establish, right, the right and the good fit together. The question for Danielle is this. So for Rawls, the social bases of self-respect are the social bases of the belief that one's aims are worth pursuing, right? And you might wonder why it's important to provide those bases as a matter of justice. But suppose you think that a condition on acceptable principles of justice is that they be congruent with somebody's good, that is, that they be congruent with the pursuit of somebody's pursuit of her aims. Then the claim that the social bases of the thought that your aims are worth pursuing just seems to fall out. I mean, it falls out of what might be a contentious claim about the necessary conditions and principles of justice, but if you grant the claim, then the move Rawls makes seems a quite natural one to make.
Yeah, okay. So on the first question, so your thought is, well, principles of justice are being conceived as principles through which we adjudicate the claims of individuals on public institutions. Right, of course it's consistent with those ideas that these claims have, that particular individuals' claims have no pro tanto authority whatsoever. It's just conceptually consistent. I'm not saying that that's what he had in mind. So what the Dewey Lectures adds is that there's a fundamental authority to make claims, and that these claims have some legitimacy by virtue of the fact that they're being made by persons. Now that still leaves up for grabs exactly how to adjudicate these things, but it seems to me it provides a fundamental basis for the authority of these claims. And as I was saying, and as Danielle was adumbrating also, it provides a kind of public basis for this public understanding of us as equals, having a dignity and it's an essentially public thing, right? So it's not just a good to be distributed by some public institution. It's something that consists in a public understanding, and it sort of brings that onto the table in a fundamental way, at least explicitly, in a way that's, if perhaps implicit, but not explicit in the theory of justice.
And in my answer actually draws a lot on Stephen's work, whom I had the pleasure of reading his work very closely about 12 years ago when the University of Chicago was trying to recruit him, and it went quite deeply into my own work, actually, in ways that I probably have not fully acknowledged, but should do. And so for me, what matters is exactly, sort of in his formulation, persons have fundamentally equal authority. And reciprocity and the basic liberties recognize that. That authority is about claims making, and it's not actually, so in other words, I am willing to give up the notion that there's a presumptive value to each individual's plans. I'm willing to give that up. Instead, I have a skeptical position. My view is that none of us is in the position to judge actually whether somebody else's plan is in fact sort of the best plan for them, and so we can presume that they know better than anybody else does. That's a different kind of claim.
Anya Carnine, SUNY Binghamton. So when I was listening to Sam's talk, I caught myself thinking, what happens after anger, or what comes after anger? Because it seemed like if reciprocity is such a robust psychological desire, Trump is the wrong choice. So anger seems to be an irrational acting out of resentment, but not to fight back and bring back reciprocity, exactly the opposite, as he was saying. But then I heard Danielle's talk, and that seemed to be an answer to what comes after anger. And the good news is, if reciprocity, if something fails as badly as something has for Trump to be elected, then people aren't broken by it. That's the story you tell. You tell the story that even if they don't get what they deserve, not necessarily broken by it. So that's the good news. But the bad news is, or the worrying news, is what you think the upshot, I think, of reciprocity is. When you said, what does reciprocity deliver? And you said the social basis of freedom. And the way I understood you, maybe I understood you wrongly, by freedom, you just meant the absence of obstacles. But that seems then an impoverished notion of freedom. So it seems that in the good fight, people fight for reciprocity. It doesn't work. They're angry, they resent, they act out. But they don't lose all their basis of self-respect. And then if they can't get what they really wanted in the first place, in the second, they sort of settle on the second thing, where they say, well, we want the social basis of freedom. But wouldn't you say you could agree with Sam that ultimately that isn't where it's supposed to end up? Ultimately, this is sort of the second best, third best, not good at all, because what you really want, because you said in self-respect by others, the larger group, not just the in-group you're in, that gives you self-respect, but self-respect from the larger group, that's what you actually really want.
Not
that's
necessarily.
What enhances it, because otherwise you stop short from that ideal.
No, that's what I disagree with that point. But the social bases of freedom in my argument are just a part of the picture of justice, right? So what I'm doing is suggesting that if you think of societies consisting of a political domain, economic domain, and social domain, Rawls gives us a beautiful and right story about political and economic domains, but he got the social domain badly wrong, and for that we need a third principle, what I have called difference without domination, which is about a framework for thinking about social relations, which is based on this principle of reciprocity. But again, its purpose is not that it delivers self-respect, but that it delivers space for autonomy, basically. That's what I mean by the social bases for freedom. So it's a removal of a certain set of obstacles. It's not the whole picture of freedom by any stretch of the imagination. You're getting that through the basic liberties also. You're getting that also through economic justice.
This is a question for Sam Schefler. Sam, in all the stuff that we carried forward from 1971, various aspects of studying a theory of justice, do you think we paid enough attention to the thesis right at the beginning of the book about the priority of justice, about justice being the first virtue of social institutions, and the implicit suggestion underlying that about the danger of injustice? How is a society going to be able to pursue any other virtue if justice itself is not attended to, if you get the grotesque distortions and injustices that we have seen in the period? It seemed to me that we have concentrated an awful lot on asking what justice is. With regard to second best theory, we've concentrated an awful lot on, well, what should we do about justice or injustice in those circumstances? But not a lot of attention, which I think your talk really did address, to the massive dangers, not only of anger, but of social dysfunction associated with justice. We've kind of lost the prophetic voice associated with the designation of injustice as a source of desolation. How are you going to hold the society together And not just for 1 year, but how are you going to hold it together for 50 years? How are people going to be able to construct lives for themselves and social relations with others if justice is not attended to? And it struck me that yours was the beginning of addressing that, and I just wondered whether you had a sense that we had neglected that notion of the priority of justice, justice being the first virtue, and the dangers of injustice.
Well, I suppose it depends on which we we're talking about. I don't think everyone's neglected it. And I don't know that philosophers working in the Rawlsian tradition have neglected it, though maybe they have. Certainly as a wider society, we've obviously neglected it, the society as a whole. I mean, I think this, tell me if this is what you have in mind, philosophers have spilt a lot of ink arguing about the difference between this principle of justice, distributive justice, and that principle of distributive justice, and sometimes it can look like a case of sort of the narcissism of small differences, you know, I mean, it's sort of which exact version of a distributive principle is the right one, rather than worrying about the fact that society is massively abandoning any serious attempt to aspire to any of these distributive principles.
But that's not just an absence of interest. Society is not interested in what we're interested in, but that it might actually be very serious danger comparable to, I don't know, neglecting national security or neglecting public health or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a question of what kind of philosophical work flows from that sort of insight. I took it Rawls himself meant to be doing that kind of philosophical work when he insisted on justice as the first virtue of social institutions. It was a very striking claim. It is a very striking claim, and it attracted attention. So I think that in some ways it's to his credit that he put the importance of justice on the agenda for discussion. Maybe what happened with philosophers is that lots of them took that, were happy to agree to that, and then just start arguing about what the exactly right principles of justice were, and maybe that's what you have in mind.
Could I just add something to that? So it's important to also bear in mind that the time of theory of justice, right? So Rawls didn't himself, of course, just put justice on the table. He put it on the table for us, let's say, as moral and political philosophers. But you had the liberation movements of the 60s, and justice was in the air in a way that it just stopped being in the air roughly from 1980 on.
Yeah, and if I could add one thing to that, I mean, it is, somebody said yesterday that it's mentioned the fact that Rawls' book was published during the Vietnam War and so on. Yeah. And Steve's right that justice and justice talk was in the air, it was in the wider society during the run-up to and the immediate aftermath of the publication of Rawls's theory. And it's not that America was a just society then, but in terms of equality and economic equality and inequality, things have gotten a lot worse. And you might ask, what's responsible for that? What happened to all that justice talk? And one sad answer is all those people who were talking about justice got rich.
Yeah.
And
regimes came in that made that, yeah, right.
And that they sort of, you know, a class of people who thought of themselves as liberal sort of captured this, you know, the parts of the social and economic system in ways that's advantaged them, and continued to pat themselves on the back for their great, you know, liberality, while, you know, sort of turning themselves into something like if they could make it a hereditary ruling class, and it's passing on the privileges to their kids but not worrying too much about everybody else's. And so that's a kind of sobering and distressing possibility for at least part of the explanation.
Naomi Sheeman, University of Minnesota, Emerita. This is a question, I guess, for Danielle and Sam. Thinking about a certain core of Trump supporters and the ones that you were talking about. And in terms of self-respect, I'm wondering whether one way of thinking about what went on was that they had and were encouraged to have, in Danielle's terms, an abject conception of self-respect. And that is that they respected themselves because they took it to be the case that in the eyes of others that they cared about, they were proper, appropriate, good Americans because of being white and Christian and male and heterosexual and so on. And the in a way, obvious way of addressing that is to say that was a completely messed up notion and nothing at all like what Rawls meant, which is, of course, a much more egalitarian and universal and thoroughly respectful notion. But I'm wondering if another way of thinking about that, not in opposition to that, but is to think that part of what might have been needed or is needed is a more stoic conception. That is, rather than the shift to seeing their self-respect as existing largely in the eyes of others, but expanding the others who count and taking a more egalitarian view of that, if taking on the more stoic conception that Danielle was articulating might be a way to go. So that if part of the pathology is an abject conception of self-respect and not just the distortions in how that was played out.
Do you want to do it or do you want me to do it?
Well, why don't we each?
So I'm not sure I would use the concepts I was trying to articulate. I'm not sure I would map them on just exactly like that. But I think the most important thing perhaps to say is a little bit to your question earlier as well, that I'm not trying to suggest that how one develops one's self-respect, let's say through a Stoic conception, or some other ones, presumably there's a limited set of healthy versions of those. I'm not trying to say that those are the solution to problems of injustice. I'm actually trying to separate the question of how we build our self-respect from the question of what's required by justice and how we respond to injustice. So I would say that to the degree that large sections of the American population have been, I think, yes, the reverse difference principle has been operating, and people have experienced that, then the response is to hold people to account. And that's where I would shift to Stephen's framework, which is why my own political philosophy, such as it is fundamentally an egalitarian participatory philosophy. And then I would, want to make an argument about what counts as ethical forms of participation, including adversarial forms of participation, so the ethics of fair fighting and things like that. So I would have no problem with sort of Trump supporters getting in there and hashing it out in the political arena. But I think to some extent that's what we're doing. So I'm actually kind of optimistic about the resilience of our institutional structures. If I had a response to your paper, it would be that I think Rawls's diagnosis does pertain, but to your final point, I don't think that means the answer lies in a comprehensive theory of justice. I think it may lie rather in political ethics and re-engagement with the ethics of participatory democratic practice.
I'll just, I know time is short, but I just want to make 2 points in response to Naomi's question. So first, I want to make it clear that what I was saying about failures of reciprocity didn't run via self-respect. I didn't use the notion of self-respect at all, and I think my emphasis was on massive inequalities with respect to all of the primary goods, as it were: money, opportunities, powers, everything. I don't really, nothing that I wanted to say depended on what view of self-respect one has. At the same time, I'd be worried about going the full Stoic route as a solution to the problem that Danielle suggested. That is to say, I guess maybe I'm a little more sympathetic to Rawls' position than you and Danielle are, or maybe my views are a little more abject or something. But it seems to me that for every Ellison, it seems to me, there are also a lot of people who experience the contempt of their fellow citizens, the failure to value their labor, the failure to take them seriously as a source of great distress. I mean, this is something I've seen Michael Sandel emphasize in some recent work, a source of humiliation and a feeling of being invisible or disappearing in a way that does not compatible with self-respect. And I take it that the rise of phenomena of like deaths of despair and so on is not a sign of, that self-respect is being preserved in the face of social neglect. And so I think, I'm inclined to think that it's absolutely right to say that it's much too simple to suppose that self-respect simply depends on the respect of others, and that's the thing you've got to provide. Self-respect is more complicated, and people are more complicated, and yeah, you can manage to maintain your self-respect in all kinds of terrible circumstances. But still, it's pretty important to have a basic structure of society that expresses in its institutions and policies the value that it attaches to each person. And that may not be an absolutely necessary condition for each person to experience self-respect, but it certainly helps a lot.
And it is an absolutely necessary condition for each person to experience freedom, I would say, right? So in other words, one's not giving up that commitment on the basis of my argument. I just want to be very clear about that.
We're over time. I'm sorry to those who wanted to ask questions. Maybe we can continue informally. So let's thank our speakers.